The Panama Canal is a ticking time bomb. What happens if it fails? The day the canal stopped. The ships didn't move that morning. Dozens of them, massive, silent silhouettes holding everything from cars to coffee, sat still against the shimmer of a half-empty lake. From the air, Gatún looked bruised and cracked, its shoreline exposing scars where water once reached. Global shipping monitors started blinking red. $270 billion in annual cargo suddenly had nowhere to go. Captains radioed for clearance. None came. Satellite feeds showed what looked like a naval blockade, but this wasn't war, it was drought. A billion-dollar artery of trade had stalled because it had run out of something as basic as water. And as the world scrambled, the truth sank in. This century-old marvel that powered globalization had quietly become its weakest link. To understand how that happened, you have to rewind to the beginning, when an impossible cut through a tropical isthmus redefined the world's map. And before the story ends, you'll realize this isn't just about a canal. It's about how every modern comfort depends on something as fragile as weather, and how quickly stability can vanish when nature decides to collect what it's owed. The artery of global trade. When the Panama Canal first opened in 1914, it wasn't just an engineering triumph. It was a rewrite of geography itself. For the first time, ships could travel between the Atlantic and Pacific without circling the entire southern tip of South America. That 82-kilometer cut through dense jungle and hard rock turned a month-long voyage into a 10-hour crossing. Within a year, trade routes recalibrated around it. The world suddenly felt smaller. The canal's design was perfectly practical and quietly radical. Instead of carving a full sea-level channel, engineers used the strength of fresh tropical rainfall. They built colossal locks, giant water elevators that lifted ships over the continental divide. At the center of that system was Gatún Lake, a man-made reservoir so large it covered what once were entire valleys and villages. Each lock sequence used millions of gallons of fresh water drawn directly from it. In effect, every ship that passed carried a piece of Panama's rain with it. Over time, those physics defined the global economy. Today, roughly 6% of global maritime trade, some 520 million tons of cargo, passes through those locks each year. The canal connects more than 1,900 ports across 170 countries, acting as a shortcut not just for ships, but for entire supply chains. From liquefied gas to soybeans to electronics, the flow through Panama keeps prices stable and goods moving efficiently from one hemisphere to another. It's easy to forget how central this narrow corridor is until something disrupts it. Most vessels traveling from East Asia to the US East Coast rely on it. The canal serves not only as a time saver, but as a foundational assumption in modern logistics, that the connection will always be open. The global inventory system, from supermarket shelves to fuel terminals, is organized around that assumption. When those transits slow, the consequences ripple far beyond the Pacific side of Panama City. But the same design that made it brilliant made it fragile. Because the locks depend on freshwater, the system lives or dies by rainfall. Each passage drains roughly 26 million gallons, water that ultimately flows into the sea. In dry years, the balance between maintaining the shipping schedule and supplying drinking water to millions of Panamanians becomes painfully tight. The locks can't function without lake levels high enough to fill them, and the country can't function if that freshwater runs out. This interdependence was mostly invisible for decades, hidden by reliable tropical rain. Then climate change began to redraw those odds. The engineers who built the canal at the dawn of the 20th century couldn't have imagined global warming or shifting rainfall patterns. For a long time, the wet season always refilled Gatún's vast basin. But decades of deforestation across Panama's watershed, combined with rising global temperatures, have steadily altered that rhythm. Seasons became irregular, storms more intense but shorter, and dry periods stretched longer each year. The canal that once felt invincible started showing cracks, not in its concrete, but in its hydrologic. Even after its great modernization in 2016, with new, wider locks designed for the behemoth Neo-Panamax vessels, the same old dependence on freshwater remained. The scale changed, the fragility didn't. Each of those new transits requires even more water, magnifying the risk in times of drought. Yet the world celebrated the expansion as proof of progress, not realizing that the upgrade also increased exposure to climate stress. Panama, for its part, embraced its role as custodian of a global lifeline. Since gaining full control of the canal from the United States in 1999, it turned the waterway into the anchor of a service-driven economy. Revenue from canal operations delivers billions to its national treasury every year and sustains thousands of jobs in logistics, transport, and finance. The canal isn't just infrastructure, it's national identity, economic backbone, and global brand all at once. Still, its foundation rests on a delicate equation: lake levels high enough, rainfall steady enough, climate forgiving enough. If any part of that equation fails, the rest unravels. That realization, slow to dawn and easy to ignore, now defines Panama's present danger. It's the kind of truth the human brain naturally resists because it shatters the illusion of control. The canal was built on the premise that water flows endlessly, but the climate of the 21st century doesn't honor that premise. And this time, there's no backup plan, no hidden valve, no miracle rescue from physics. And so, a structure conceived to conquer geography finds itself at the mercy of weather. When that weather turns against it, trade routes begin to tremble. That's when the world discovered that the canal's true limit wasn't engineering, it was rainfall. Everything that followed began from that single, overlooked truth. The freshwater problem. Every drop that moves a ship across Panama starts as rain. It falls on the mountain forests, gathers into streams, then feeds the reservoirs that power the locks. Gatún Lake is the heart of that system, a man-made inland sea that connects the canal's Atlantic and Pacific approaches. It doesn't just lift vessels, it sustains much of the country itself. When the clouds fail to come, the whole equation collapses. For decades, engineers treated Gatún's vast surface as infinite. On charts it looked enormous, spreading over 430 square kilometers, ringed by dense green hills. Yet every transit through the locks consumes more than 26 million gallons of its water, roughly enough to supply a small city for a day. Once drained, most of it flows straight into the ocean, gone forever. Multiply that by dozens of daily crossings, and the canal's miracle of motion becomes a staggering act of consumption. Each ship is both passenger and siphon. That system worked because Panama's climate used to be predictable. The wet season, stretching from May through December, refilled the reservoirs faster than the canal released them. Rainfall over the basin averaged more than 100 inches a year, enough to keep Gatún comfortably above its operating depth. But in the last 2 decades, that pattern fractured. The atmosphere grew hotter, the trade winds shifted, and the rains became unreliable. When global temperatures zig upward, Central America swings between extremes, torrential deluges one season, punishing drought the next. The canal sits precisely where those forces collide. The most brutal demonstration came in 2023 and 2024. By mid-dry season, satellite images showed Gatún's shoreline retreating like a tide in reverse. The water surface shimmered several meters below its historical average. Patches of former lakebed turned to baked clay. Engineers ran weekly level forecasts, then daily, then hourly, trying to ration lock transits, while households in Panama City faced water restrictions. The crisis forced the canal to cut capacity by 1/3, an unprecedented decision that left hundreds of vessels waiting, sometimes for weeks. Maritime analytics firms estimated that global shipping throughput through the canal fell nearly 30% during those months. For an artery carrying roughly 6% of world trade, that number was catastrophic. Inside the control rooms overlooking Miraflores and Pedro Miguel locks, technicians calculated every gallon like accountants. Reservoir managers diverted flows from auxiliary lakes, opening and closing gates in careful sequence to maintain pressure in the locks. Tankers and gas carriers, too heavy to clear at the new reduced depth, anchored offshore, their schedules collapsing. Pilots reported the surreal silence of idle machinery where pumps had once roared around the clock. For veteran engineers, it felt like watching the heartbeat of the nation slow. Behind that crisis lay simple physics. Less rainfall from May to August meant 4 to 5 centimeters less inflow per week. Hotter air accelerated surface evaporation, millions of gallons rising invisibly each day. Some scientists pointed to an intensifying El Niño, others to long-term deforestation around the basin. Either way, the conclusion was grim. Panama's rain-fed system had no buffer for a warming world. Every additional half-degree of temperature meant more loss into the sky and less water available for lifting ships. The drought exposed something deeper than a technical shortage. It revealed a conflict of priorities baked into the country's identity. Gatún Lake supplies drinking water to more than half of Panama's population. When levels drop, the Canal Authority must choose between domestic consumption and commercial traffic. During the 2023 emergency, the trade-off became brutally visible. Neighborhoods in Colón rationed water to 4 hours a day, while luxury container vessels still transited under emergency quotas. The optics stirred resentment. Talk radio callers accused the government of valuing foreign cargo over local lives. Within Panama, the drought wasn't just an environmental event, it was a social reckoning. Scientists rushed to model the future. Under a high-emission climate scenario, they warned severely dry years like 2023 could occur every 2 decades, then every 10, then effectively every other year by century's end. Even moderate projections showed a 5% annual probability of extreme low water conditions, double the historic rate. By the late 204s, that would mean chronic restrictions, not rare emergencies. The canal's margin of safety would vanish. Those numbers are staggering when translated into trade. Each day of restricted operation costs global markets millions in delayed goods and inflated freight rates. Grain exporters in the American Midwest watch the rain gauges at Gatún as closely as their own harvest forecasts. Asian electronics manufacturers factor canal delays into delivery schedules. The drought turned a local weather anomaly into a global logistics variable, measurable on balance sheets in Houston, Seoul, and Rotterdam. For Panama itself, the event became an inflection point. It forced the Canal Authority, the ACP, to admit publicly that water scarcity was its existential threat. Internal reports described hydrological vulnerability as the single greatest operational risk. The authority's administrators began drafting a 10-year, $8.5 billion strategic program focused almost entirely on water security. Signature Project, a new reservoir on the Rio Indio to the west of Gatún, meant to add roughly 1.25 billion cubic meters of extra storage. On paper, that capacity could restore up to 15 additional vessel transits a day during future dry seasons. The plan also included deepening channels, dredging silted intakes, and experimenting with water-saving basins around the newer locks. It was, effectively, a reinvention of the canal around its weakest component. Yet even as those plans advanced, questions grew. Environmental groups warned that damming the Rio Indio would flood villages, displace 2,500 residents, and alter regional ecosystems. Hydrologists cautioned that the new reservoir would still depend on the same erratic rainfall pattern. It was an expansion of capacity, not a guarantee of supply. Politicians framed it as a patriotic response to crisis. Critics compared it to building a bigger bucket beneath a shrinking roof. Beyond the technical debate lay a more unsettling issue: the psychological shift of realizing the canal could fail, not through sabotage or blockade, but through thirst. For over a century, its obstacles had been military or mechanical. Now the enemy was atmospheric. That shift has rippled through every level of policy and business thinking in Panama. Companies explore desalination projects on both coasts. Urban planners consider reservoir conservation as a national security measure. Schoolchildren learn about Gatún's water cycles right alongside math and history, as if understanding climate had become part of civic defense. The freshwater problem, once hidden in hydrological charts, is now part of Panama's cultural vocabulary. In conversation, people talk about the level, what yesterday's rainfall did, how many centimeters the lake rose or fell. In coffee shops around Panama City, digital screens showing canal traffic now sit next to updates of reservoir readings. It's the pulse of the nation, visible again after a century of abstraction. The canal remains open, but only by constant maneuvering. On any dry season morning, dispatchers check depth reports before assigning pilot slots. Sometimes, a few centimeters decide whether a $100 million vessel can pass. That ritual, repeated daily, marks the threshold between functioning economy and global logjam. And every year, the odds tighten. Water has become the canal's currency and its curse. Enough rain, and the world keeps turning. Too little, and trade grinds to a halt. This is the paradox written into Panama's success. The same freshwater that made its fortune now threatens its future. The droughts of 2023 and 2024 weren't interruptions, they were previews. As one of the engineers whispered while staring across Gatun's cracked shoreline, "You think you're controlling the water, but really, it's controlling you." The line stuck partly because it captured a deeper fear, that maybe the entire global economy works that way. Every empire runs until the resource it's built on disappears. The next crisis, everyone agrees, is only a few dry months away. When the water vanishes. At sunrise, a soft mist usually hangs over Gatún Lake, but on this morning the haze rose over a shrunken shoreline. The waterline had dropped so far that old tree stumps, remnants of the jungle flooded a century ago, stood exposed. Engineers arriving for the morning shift watched the scene in silence. On their monitors, the depth numbers blinked in red, just shy of the minimum level needed to fill the locks. Every ship scheduled for transit that day faced uncertainty. The team at the main control tower started counting every cubic meter. They knew precisely how much each vessel would cost in water, a calculation measured not in money but gallons. The canal's operating routine had become an exercise in triage. Smaller cargo ships might pass, larger ones were told to wait. The hum of diesel engines, once constant along the lake, was replaced by idle quiet. Anchored freighters waited for permission that might never come. Radio chatter crackled across frequencies as captains pleaded for updates. For the canal pilots and maintenance crews, it was an inversion of everything they knew. They'd been trained to manage flood surges, not scarcity. Now the pumps ran in reverse, trying to pool what little remained. In some basins, water levels fell so low that turtles and fish gathered in trapped pockets, visible from the decks above. In the locked chambers, concrete walls shimmered under the heat, streaked with mineral stains from decades of contact with retreating water. At Miraflores, an engineer named Carlos kept a small notebook of daily measurements. For weeks, his entries read like a slow-motion disaster: 2 centimeters down, locks restricted again, traffic backlog 140 ships. When he drove home each night past the dry edges of Gatún, he passed fishing boats grounded on mud flats. Once blue inlets had turned to pale dust, the air smelling faintly metallic from baked sediment. Every day looked more like low tide, except no tide was coming back. The global ripple was immediate. Logistics dashboards lit up with delays. Freight insurers recalculated premiums. Charter rates for ships able to squeeze through soared. Some operators paid millions in auction bids to jump the queue. A record $4 million transferred for one slot in the Neo-Panamax locks. Others rerouted thousands of miles around the Cape of Good Hope or up toward the Suez, adding weeks to delivery schedules. For every additional day a container idled, energy prices, grain futures, and retail inventories shifted by fractions that multiplied into billions. Panama's crisis had become everyone's problem. Oil refineries along the Gulf Coast reported disrupted deliveries of crude. Asian exporters scrambled to secure alternative routes. By late month, economists estimated that every hour of canal delay affected roughly $500 million in global trade value. Yet in Panama City, the crisis felt both distant and intimate. Tap pressure in some neighborhoods dropped to a trickle. Reservoirs feeding households were being siphoned to keep the locks operational. The same water that lifted ships now determined whether families could shower. Inside the Canal Authority's boardroom, the tone was grim. Revenue projections had collapsed by more than $400 million, a 7% drop that pierced directly into the national treasury. The chairman's presentation replaced graphs of tonnage with graphs of rainfall. Every discussion circled back to one variable: lake level versus lock demand. Civil planners began framing the dilemma not as engineering but economics. How to price scarcity when both human consumption and global trade claim the same resource. Across the isthmus, those abstractions turned personal. In the small fishing town of Gamboa, residents watched as moored boats rested sideways on cracked mud. Local guides who once ferried tourists to see giant ships now drove spectators to look at how low the water had fallen. "It feels like the heart stopped beating," one of them said quietly. For older Panamanians, it was almost unthinkable. The canal had been their nation's steady constant, immune to chaos elsewhere. Suddenly, it looked mortal. As the weeks dragged on, desperation bred improvisation. Engineers modified lock schedules, pairing vessels of similar draft to conserve water. They experimented with tandem transits, partially refilling a chamber to float two lighter ships instead of one heavy carrier. Tugboat captains joked bleakly that they'd joined the world's most expensive water rationing program. Every success bought only another day of operation. Meanwhile, international shipping companies filed formal complaints, insisting on transparency about when normal levels would return. But no forecast could promise that. Meteorologists predicted the tail of a persistent El Niño would keep rains scarce for months. The Canal Authority issued daily bulletins that read like storm updates in reverse. No precipitation recorded in Upper Basin. Water conservation protocols remain active. The financial strain deepened. Even as total revenue dropped, the contribution owed to the government, over $3 billion, couldn't. The Treasury had already factored that money into its public budget. To meet the obligation, administrators pulled from maintenance reserves, deferring repairs. It was a short-term fix that risked long-term safety. Every bolt of the locks depended on regular servicing. Postpone that too long, and corrosion becomes catastrophe. Yet the human dimension overshadowed the spreadsheets. Political talk shows replayed scenes of tankers stuck mid-transit, followed by footage of residents filling jugs from rationed taps. The contrast struck a nerve. Protesters gathered near Panama City, carrying banners reading "Agua para todos, water for all." Officials reminded crowds that canal revenue funded hospitals and infrastructure, but the argument landed weakly. For the first time, the canal wasn't a unifying symbol, it was a dividing line. By early season's end, Gatún had fallen to its lowest operational mark in memory. The locks functioned like a patient on life support, every decision calibrated to conserve a few inches more. The crisis team met daily at dawn, scanning satellite feeds of cloud cover over the basin. A single rainstorm could shift the entire equation by centimeters. When showers finally came one evening, technicians gathered on rooftops to watch. Warm drops hit the hot concrete like applause. It wasn't enough to refill the reservoir, but for a few hours, they heard again the familiar drumming that once defined Panama's rhythm. That brief relief didn't erase the new awareness. The canal's lifeblood could vanish without warning. What had always seemed permanent now required constant negotiation with nature. In boardrooms, engineers began describing their mission differently, not maintaining an asset, but managing uncertainty. The phrase stuck. It captured the shift from confidence to caution that now guides every operation. Long after the rains resumed, ships awaiting passage still bore the memory of that stoppage. Global logistics planners began adding a new column to every risk table: drought disruption potential. Insurance models codified what crews already knew. Climate variability was no longer a distant threat, but an everyday parameter. For Panama, the psychological aftershock lingered. Children who once dreamed of piloting ships now spoke of studying hydrology. Farmers upstream volunteered for watershed reforestation programs. The drought had rewritten the national narrative from triumph to stewardship. As one historian put it, the first canal conquered distance, the second will have to conquer heat. When water vanishes, it doesn't just expose lake beds, it exposes dependence on rain, on equilibrium, on assumption. The drought laid bare that the canal's true machinery wasn't steel or concrete, but the invisible cycle of clouds and rivers that sustain it. Every dry morning since then is a reminder that even the greatest feats of infrastructure rest on something as fragile as weather. Panama's $8.5 billion gamble. Construction crews arrived before dawn, their headlights cutting through a humid haze in the Val del Rio Indio. The jungle here had once been silent except for insects and birds, but now it echoed with the grind of bulldozers and survey drones mapping the future lakebed. This was Panama's newest promise, the project that would supposedly save the canal from drought. Officially, it's the Rio Indio Water Management Program. In conversation, everyone calls it the gamble. $8.5 billion to rebuild the country's relationship with water. The logic seems straightforward. If there isn't enough rain, store more of it. The new reservoir would dam the Rio Indio, a river west of Gatún, flooding valleys to create an immense artificial lake holding 1.25 billion cubic meters of freshwater. That extra supply could sustain 15 additional vessel passages per day in dry seasons, enough to keep canal revenue and national income stable. Engineers called it an elegant fix. Critics called it an act of desperation. On paper, it looked impressive. Simulation models predicted that during moderate drought years, the system could increase operational days by nearly 20%. The reservoir would connect to Gatún through tunnels and pumping stations, allowing managers to balance inflows between basins like hydraulic accountants. Even the numbers had political charm. $6 billion for the dam itself, another $400 million for compensation to affected communities, and the rest allocated to pipeline extensions, port expansions, and environmental mitigation. It was the largest single investment since the 2016 canal expansion. But optimism didn't fill the valley. For the 2,500 residents living along the Rio Indio's banks, the project meant losing everything. Their homes sat inside the planned floodplain, where survey stakes marked future shorelines in bright orange tape. Farmers watched machines carve access roads and wondered where they'd go once the water rose. "They tell us it's for the good of Panama," said an older villager named Elena, "but we are Panama too." Local leaders organized meetings demanding fair relocation terms, though few believed promises from Panama City. Environmental scientists joined the opposition, warning that submerging the Rio Indio forest corridor would erase habitats for countless species. The basin, still largely untouched, served as a natural sponge moderating rainfall runoff into Gatún. Flooding it might undermine the same watershed stability the project aimed to restore. A biologist from the University of Panama summarized the paradox bluntly: "We are sacrificing one ecosystem to rescue another, and both feed the same canal." Inside the Panama Canal Authority's headquarters, the pressure was enormous. The 2023-24 drought had exposed the canal's vulnerability with brutal clarity, and the world expected a fix. When administrators presented the 10-year strategic plan to the National Assembly, they used the phrase water security more often than economic recovery. The project's public pitch evolved from saving ships to saving livelihoods. Financing arrangements combined state bonds with private investment, an unusual move that signaled just how dependent Panama's fiscal health had become on reassuring foreign markets. The ACP framed the gamble as part of a broader transformation: cleaner energy, smarter locks, and eventually carbon neutrality by 205. They insisted the dam would power small hydroelectric turbines, generate jobs, and form the backbone of a climate-resilient canal. Campaign ads showed children watching raindrops ripple across a reservoir, the slogan reading "El Agua nos une," water unites us. Yet for villagers facing eviction, unity felt one-sided. As work accelerated, technical controversies multiplied. Some hydrologists argued that transfer tunnels between Rio Indio and Gatún required pumping uphill, costing huge amounts of energy and potentially shrinking the carbon savings touted by planners. Others pointed to preliminary rainfall models suggesting the western basin might not receive enough steady precipitation to justify the lake's size. The ACP countered with long-term simulations showing that even partial inflow could buffer droughts. It became a public duel of graphs and trust. Meanwhile, in Panama's financial sector, nervousness grew. The government relied on annual canal contributions, roughly $2 billion, to balance its budget. Any delay or cost overrun on the dam could threaten that flow. The Ministry of Economy projected that if droughts persisted at recent frequency, GDP growth would drop by nearly a full percentage point within 3 years. To secure confidence, officials branded the expansion program as a national emergency of strategic infrastructure, fast-tracking approvals that bypassed certain environmental reviews. Critics saw technocracy turning into necessity. Internationally, reactions were mixed. Shipping companies applauded the move, eager for assurances that future seasons wouldn't strand their cargo. Environmental watchdogs issued statements urging transparency and indigenous consultation. The United States quietly expressed support, framing the project as vital to Western trade security. China, which had shown interest in canal-adjacent logistics hubs, was notably silent, perhaps wary of appearing opportunistic. The geopolitics of water had entered Panama's domestic blueprint. On the ground, the human toll unfolded in mundane routines. Families packed belongings into trucks, teachers reassigned schools uphill from flood zones, compensation checks trickled in slower than promised. Archaeologists rushed to document pre-Columbian artifacts soon destined for submersion. By evening, campfires dotted ridgelines where people waited for relocation buses, watching excavators crawl through the valley below. From the air, the construction site glowed like a scar of progress cutting through green forest. Journalists began calling it the billion-dollar bathtub, half in admiration, half in disbelief. When photos circulated of concrete foundations emerging amid muddy terrain, social media filled with parallel captions, salvation or delusion. For canal administrators, either interpretation demanded completion. Failure to finish would signal national weakness. For residents, the hope was simpler, that the government wouldn't forget them once the water covered their doorsteps. By late 2027, planners projected the reservoir's first stage complete. Engineers outlined new protocols for balancing the combined system. When Gatún drops below threshold, Indio would release. When rainfall surges, both lakes would store. The model looked tidy in presentations, but even ACP insiders admitted that management would depend on daily improvisation. Climate patterns were too erratic to script. "We are building flexibility into concrete," one hydrologist joked darkly. Environmental trade-offs deepened. The flooding of forest areas released methane from decomposing vegetation, generating unexpected emissions during the first filling phase. Marine biologists monitoring the downstream river mouth recorded changes in salinity affecting coastal fish nurseries. For every projected benefit, another complication surfaced. Panama's engineers faced the unbearable tension of trying to engineer balance in a system now governed by imbalance. Still, optimism persisted at the political level. The president visited the site flanked by cameras, declaring that Panama would never again be hostage to drought. Flags waved above equipment yards as if over a military campaign. Behind his speech, a freshly poured spillway gleamed in the sun, symbol of control in a year defined by unpredictability. The ceremony ended just before a heavy afternoon storm rolled through, soaking the crowd. For a moment, cheers drowned out the thunder. In private, canal administrators acknowledged quieter fears. What if rainfall patterns simply kept weakening? What if the new reservoir filled only halfway each year? Billions in infrastructure would then merely shift scarcity from one basin to another. Yet they also knew choosing inaction was worse. Doing nothing risked global trade chaos and domestic turmoil. Doing something, even imperfectly, at least bought time. As one official confided, "We're not betting on success forever, just survival until conditions stabilize." Panama's $8.5 billion gamble captures a psychology shared worldwide, the belief that technology can outbuild climate. The dam represents hope, defiance, and necessity, all poured into concrete. Standing on the rim of the excavation, you can feel both pride and doubt, the hum of engines, the whistle of wind across clearing hills, the sense that the nation is reshaping its landscape to regain confidence. Watch long enough, and you realize this construction site is a mirror. What you're looking at isn't just concrete, but our instinct to build faster than we imagine collapse. Yet the question lingers, like the heavy air before rain. If the clouds no longer come, what will all that engineering mean? A nation bound to its canal. Every Panamanian knows someone whose livelihood, directly or indirectly, depends on the canal. Maybe it's a brother working as a tugboat operator or a cousin running a logistics business in Colón. For most citizens, the canal isn't a distant marvel. It's the background rhythm of their economy. When its gates open, money flows. When they stall, the country holds its breath. At the height of normal times, Canal operations contribute more than 13% of Panama's GDP. Each fiscal year, around $3 billion flows from the canal's revenue into the national treasury. It's hard to overstate what that means. Those funds run hospitals, pave roads, and sustain social programs that link the canal's success to the fabric of daily life. If a teacher gets paid on time, if a clinic stays stocked, somewhere in that budget is toll money collected from a passing container ship. That dependence has shaped generations of policy. When Panama took full control from the United States in 1999, the move wasn't just symbolic, it was a transfer of destiny. Leaders promised to use canal wealth to lift the nation into a new era of prosperity, and for a while it worked. The economy boomed. Skyscrapers rose along Panama City's waterfront, banking districts flourished, and the country came to be called the hub of the Americas. But that prosperity carried a hidden fragility. Everything, from credit ratings to public confidence, leaned on Gatún Lake's waterline. Even before the droughts, economic analysts warned that such reliance was dangerous. A single operational hiccup could rattle the country's accounts. And when the 2023-24 water crisis hit, those fears became real. National revenue projections dropped sharply, and foreign investors started asking hard questions. Could Panama truly guarantee stability if the canal's output was no longer reliable? The strain revealed how entangled the canal is with domestic politics. In the National Assembly, ministers argued whether the crisis was an environmental issue or an economic emergency. Some pushed for faster diversification, investing in fintech, tourism, and renewable energy to reduce dependence. Others insisted the canal was too valuable to loosen focus. Instead, they proposed doubling down on modernization and expansion. The debates weren't just technical, they cut to the core of national identity. To question the canal was to question Panama's place in the world. While politicians debated, the drought's financial effects spread. Lower traffic meant less fuel sold in port, fewer repairs ordered in dry docks, and quieter warehouses in Colon's free zone. Truck convoys between terminals thinned. Small restaurants that served dockworkers saw their customers disappear. Every ripple traced back to the same deficit of rainfall. Local journalists described the slowdown with an eerie metaphor. The economy is drying out too. For Panama's government, the immediate challenge was fiscal survival. Treasury planners needed the canal's usual multi-billion contribution to cover national expenses. But with revenue down more than 7%, they faced uncomfortable arithmetic. Cutting programs risked unrest, borrowing threatened credit downgrades. Eventually, legislators approved a temporary spending freeze and drew from reserve funds, effectively betting that future rains and tolls would restore balance. It was a gamble made in accounting ledgers, but felt by ordinary citizens who saw infrastructure projects paused mid-construction. Another complication simmered: the closure of the Cobre Panama mine, once one of Latin America's largest copper exporters. Environmental protests and legal disputes shuttered it just as canal revenues dipped. The twin shocks hit state income like twin waves. Without mining royalties or full canal dividends, government economists spoke openly of a revenue desert. Public trust wavered. Outside investors began scrutinizing Panama's bond yields, wary of a country whose two major money spinners were both flirting with crisis. In response, officials promoted a vision of economic reinvention. They invited international partnerships in fintech, digital banking, and green logistics. The message was transformation, not desperation, but everyone understood why it was necessary. The canal's vulnerability had exposed the thinness of Panama's diversification. Finance hubs and tourism zones couldn't yet fill the gap left by even a small reduction in toll revenue. For a dollarized economy already exposed to global cycles, the drought functioned like an X-ray showing every structural weakness. Still, pride surrounding the canal runs deep. Many Panamanians see it not just as infrastructure, but as proof of national competence, a heritage reclaimed after decades of foreign control. That emotional tie complicates calls to move beyond it. When activist groups argued for restraining water use to protect reservoirs, veteran canal workers bristled. Turning off the canal, one union leader said, is like stopping our heartbeat. That sentiment captures the psychological lock-in. To preserve sovereignty, Panama feels it must keep the canal running at all costs, even when nature resists. The government's messaging leaned on patriotism. Public campaigns reminded citizens that every ship's toll supported national unity. Billboards displayed slogans like "Our water, our future," showing canal scenes alongside images of farmers and students. But beneath the optimism ran anxiety. Economists warned that consistent droughts could trim GDP growth by 0.5 percentage point annually. The central bank modeled scenarios where prolonged shortages forced rationing of transits, cutting revenues so steeply that national debt ratios would spike. These weren't remote possibilities, they were spreadsheets waiting for dry weather to become real again. That threat turned into political fuel. Opposition parties accused leaders of mismanaging resources and neglecting diversification. Street protests mixed environmental activists with civil service unions demanding stable funding. The Canal Authority, historically independent, found itself dragged into public scrutiny. Its annual report, once a matter of technical pride, became political ammunition. Every figure on rainfall or tonnage now carried social meaning. Meanwhile, global investors watched closely. Panama's reputation as a logistics and banking hub depended on its image of steady governance. Credit agencies flagged the drought's impact as a systemic environmental risk. Private analysts began describing Panama as an eco-exposed economy, a term once reserved for poorer nations lacking infrastructure. The irony strung. After building one of the most advanced engineering works on the planet, Panama's fate still hinged on the whims of weather. Inside the Canal Authority, directors faced a dilemma that stretched beyond finance. Their 10-year strategic plan, costing billions, required stable political backing, yet every fiscal shortfall fueled skepticism. Could the government sustain investment when citizens struggled with rising costs and water restrictions? Some managers argued for inviting private consortiums. Others warned that foreign stakes could erode national sovereignty. The canal might have been global infrastructure, but Panamanians still saw it as theirs, untouchable, sacred. Through all this, the voices of ordinary workers revealed the contradiction best. Dock supervisors spoke of reduced shifts. Pilots, once proud symbols of national skill, worried about fewer transits meaning less income. Yet even as times hardened, none talked about abandoning the canal. "It built this country," one said simply. "Everything else revolves around it." That statement could have been written into the Constitution. The cultural bond extends beyond economics. The canal's story, the struggle to build it, the fight to reclaim it, the pride of operating it, is woven into schoolbooks and music. To question its centrality feels almost unpatriotic. That collective attachment gives Panama strength, but also inertia. Admitting vulnerability requires confronting identity, and identity is harder to rebuild than concrete. Yet adaptation is coming, if slowly. Younger entrepreneurs push for renewable industries and climate-aware urban planning. Universities expand hydrology and environmental science programs. Civic groups advocate watershed reforestation, arguing that saving forests is as vital as repairing locks. The idea of diversification is shifting from buzzword to survival strategy. Still, the canal's gravity remains irresistible. Multinationals base regional headquarters in Panama largely because of it. The nation's skyline, its currency stability, its global relevance, all orbit that 82-kilometer channel. Its infrastructure turned ideology, and ideology doesn't change easily. As one economist phrased it during a televised debate, Panama is not just the country with the canal, it's the country of the canal. That single distinction carries emotional gravity because it reveals a truth about dependence we rarely admit. National budgets, foreign policy, even social cohesion rest on one asset built more than a century ago. When climate threatens it, everything downstream trembles, and so does the sense of national identity built on its stability. In the capital, as officials discuss water management and sustainability, they know the paradox they're living in. To secure their future, they must depend on the very system that endangers them. The canal remains both lifeline and hazard. Until true diversification takes root, every dry season will test whether Panama can sustain its prosperity on hope and rainfall. For now, the canal keeps delivering, ships still glide through, tariffs still tally, and the Treasury still receives its billions. But in every boardroom conversation, a quiet question lingers: what happens the next time the lakes drop? Because when they do, the issue won't just be hydraulic, it'll be national. And as global pressures mount, those political and economic storms are only the beginning. The power games behind the locks. Global trade treats the Panama Canal like a neutral highway. But neutrality was never part of its design. It's always been a power instrument disguised as infrastructure. Whoever ensures that ships can pass decides, in subtle but profound ways, who moves first and who waits. As drought transformed the canal's capacity, it also reshaped that balance of leverage, reviving old rivalries and generating new ones. For the United States, the canal has always been more than an engineering marvel. It's a strategic artery. Even after returning control to Panama in 1999, Washington never truly let go of its interest. About 40% of the cargo moved through the canal originates or terminates in U.S. ports. LNG tankers from Texas, grain from Louisiana, and manufactured goods headed for the eastern seaboard all rely on that shortcut. When the drought limited daily transits to barely 30 ships, U.S. logistics planners in Houston and New York felt the contraction instantly. Shipping costs soared, but the deeper worry was geopolitical. If Panama couldn't guarantee steady passage, who could step in? Officially, the United States kept its distance, offering technical aid through climate resilience programs. Unofficially, its defense analysts began talking again about strategic corridors, a term that hadn't been used since the Cold War. Some in Washington quietly urged Panama's government to ensure that foreign powers, particularly China, didn't gain new footholds through canal-adjacent investments. The reasoning was plain. The canal remained a linchpin of supply chains that sustained America's defense and economic dominance. Losing influence there, even symbolically, was unacceptable. China's presence lingered in the background, subtle but persistent. Over the past decade, Chinese state-linked companies had financed or bid for port facilities at both ends of the canal, part of a broader belt and road push across Latin America. When one operator with Chinese backing gained management rights over key terminal in Colón, it triggered sharp debate in the Panamanian Assembly. Critics warned that the country was allowing rival superpowers to turn its geography into a bargaining chip. First they controlled our trade, now they want our water, said one outspoken legislator. Behind the rhetoric lay practical anxiety. The drought had already forced the canal to limit Neo-Panamax crossings, the exact class of ships most used by Chinese exporters. In Beijing's view, the canal's instability underscored the vulnerability of its own supply lines. Chinese planners began studying alternative logistics corridors, including a proposed Atlantic-Pacific rail project in Colombia and discussions about Pacific port expansions in Mexico. Each plan was both economic diversification and strategic insurance against Panama's fragility. For Panama City, the attention was double-edged. Foreign capital meant relief, but also scrutiny. The government walked a tightrope: welcome investment, reject control. Officials publicly emphasized sovereignty while quietly vetting every major port-related bid for security implications. Insiders called it the shadow war, a constant effort to keep the canal global but not captured. "We are the host of the world," a senior advisor said, "but we can't let any guest rearrange the furniture." Europe watched from a distance, dependent yet powerless. Nearly 10% of its Atlantic-Pacific container trade uses the canal, particularly routes linking the Netherlands, Spain, and Italy to Asia. When restrictions tightened, European logistics companies found themselves rerouting through the Suez Canal, a detour that added fuel and time, but felt safer than waiting in Panama's queue. Ironically, while climate made Panama less reliable, political instability elsewhere, especially in the Red Sea, made shippers long for its former predictability. Geography offered no neutral option anymore. Inside Panama, the competition among global players influenced daily decision-making. The ACP's board meetings began including briefings on security awareness, something never standard before. Governments from the US, Japan, and South Korea offered technical cooperation grants framed around climate adaptation, but understood as diplomatic gestures. Each project, the restoration of watershed forests, the modernization of navigation systems, carried symbolic stakes. Every donor hoped Panama would remember the favor when assigning future contracts. As water scarcity worsened, power became visible not only in who financed dredging, but in who received transit priority. When capacity dropped below design thresholds, the canal introduced a controversial auction system for scarce passage slots. Major energy traders, many tied to governments, bid millions to reserve scheduling ahead of competitors. For smaller nations shipping agricultural goods, those price wars felt like economic exclusion. Executives in Lima and Quito grumbled that global trade had turned into hydro-diplomacy, alliances arranged around rainfall. Washington paid close attention. The shortages gave the US Navy renewed justification to expand humanitarian cooperation exercises with Panama's forces. Officially, they trained for disaster response. Unofficially, observers read them as reminders of partnership. A few think tanks even floated the idea that the US should treat canal drought resilience as a matter of hemispheric defense. Though no one expected American troops near the locks, the tone suggested that the canal's fate was once again part of grand strategy calculus. Panama's government learned to play both sides. Presidents alternated between speeches praising US cooperation and meetings courting Chinese logistics firms for financing the Indio Dam. Diplomats called it multipolar pragmatism, locals just called it survival. In a country built on connecting oceans, balancing powers came naturally, yet the strain showed. Transparency International ranked Panama's governance risk rising, warning that billion-dollar climate projects could invite corruption if oversight failed. In drought years, water wasn't the only scarce commodity, trust was too. Beyond Washington and Beijing, smaller actors maneuvered quietly. Japan and South Korea sought long-term freight agreements ensuring slot access for their automotive and electronics shipments. Regional neighbors eyed Panama's vulnerability as an opening for themselves. Mexico, busy developing its own interoceanic rail corridor, openly promoted the idea that a stable land bridge could complement, or replace, the canal during crises. Its marketing pitch included a subtle message. Unlike Panama, Mexico didn't rely on rain. Back in Panama's political scene, the climate crisis amplified nationalist sentiment. The public grew wary of external pressure, especially when foreign commentators framed the canal's problems as global losses rather than local suffering. Television debates turned fiery as pundits accused both superpowers of treating Panama as a puddle to fight over. The ACP responded by launching a campaign emphasizing autonomy, new logos, public tour, school programs, all designed to remind citizens that the canal was sovereign soil. It was public relations as defense strategy. Still, the perception of vulnerability lingered. Analysts noted that as the canal's operational days declined, global freight routes subtly reoriented. Some South American exporters shipped eastward entirely to avoid dependence on the locks. Others diversified ports, diluting Panama's dominance. Each rerouted container represented not just lost revenue, but lost influence. The term Panama Premium, the intangible advantage of controlling the world's shortcut, began to fade from trade journals. A drought, it turned out, could erode geopolitical capital as surely as it drained lake levels. Meanwhile, the canal's administrators tried to reframe the conversation globally. They presented water scarcity as a shared climate problem rather than a national failure, hoping to attract multilateral aid instead of bilateral control. Invitations went to the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, even environmental foundations. The message, supporting Panama's water system, meant safeguarding global commerce. It worked partially. International grants flowed in, funding sensors, modeling software, and reforestation. But each contribution arrived with conditions, reports, and oversight committees, layers of influence that ironically diluted sovereignty while defending it. Behind closed doors, diplomats acknowledged the paradox. The canal's strategic weight had never been heavier precisely because its function was shakier. Every restriction reminder proved how quickly one nation's drought could destabilize continents. The canal was now both crown jewel and crisis vector of globalization. In 2026, a revealing exchange occurred at a logistics summit in Singapore. A Panamanian delegate used a phrase that captured the moment's irony. "Our problem is that everyone depends on us, but we depend on the weather." The audience laughed, but uneasily. For centuries, maritime power rested on steel and fuel. Now, it rested on rainfall measured halfway around the world. That realization transformed the canal's political identity. It was no longer simply infrastructure connecting oceans. It was leverage in climate diplomacy. When the ACP requested climate financing, it didn't frame the argument as charity. It called itself a global stabilizer under threat. Nations that benefited from its traffic were expected to help defend it against the shifting sky. And in the era of fragile supply chains, that argument resonated. Even so, Panama remained careful to avoid appearing beholden. Officials publicly declined certain Chinese credit lines, citing sovereignty, while simultaneously signing memoranda with U.S. environmental agencies. It was a choreography of balance: accept help, avoid capture. In corridors of the foreign ministry, staff joked that Panama had invented wet neutrality, friendly with everyone, indebted to none, yet constantly negotiating for water. Underneath the diplomacy, daily decisions at the locks retained their quiet gravity. Each morning, dispatchers divided limited transits among continents, knowing that fairness today might mean favor lost tomorrow. The canal had become a miniature arena of international politics played out in scheduling software and tide charts. Whoever secured passage at a critical moment earned not just profit, but prestige. As one analyst in Panama City put it, the canal has turned from gatekeeper of trade to barometer of hierarchy. When the water falls, history rises. The same old contest between powers, fought this time in cubic meters instead of cannons. But the psychological battle isn't just between nations. It's inside every decision maker trying to choose between survival today and sovereignty tomorrow. And with every dry season tightening the rules, control over the locks once again feels like control over the world's pulse. The domino effect on global trade. When the canal slowed to a crawl, the tremors moved faster than the ships. Freight delays rippled outward through industries that rarely think about Panama at all. On a winter morning, a port scheduler in Los Angeles watched his terminal's container stacks fill faster than he could clear them. Cargo from East Asia that should have arrived via the canal now came around Cape Horn, 2 weeks late and thousands of dollars costlier per container. Multiply that by hundreds of vessels, and suddenly inflation had a new culprit: the weather on an isthmus thousands of miles away. Energy traders felt it next. Liquefied natural gas carriers that usually traveled through the canal to supply Europe were rerouted halfway around the world. Spot prices swung upward as ships burned extra fuel and tied up refineries waiting for deliveries. Analysts traced a 5% jump in regional fuel costs directly to delayed crossings. The price of electricity in Texas, the cost of fertilizer in Brazil, and even winter heating bills in Germany all began to reflect the absence of rain in Panama. Manufacturers who had optimized supply chains to the hour learned how brittle that precision really was. Auto plants near Detroit reported missing parts that had been stranded on Pacific freighters. Electronics assemblers in South Korea and Japan juggled production schedules, watching shipping trackers like meteorologists watching storm radar. A closed lock in Central America could now halt an assembly line half a world away. Ports far from Panama became pressure valves for the backlog. Houston, Savannah, and Norfolk scrambled to receive East Coast-bound goods rerouted from Pacific ports. Warehouses overflowed, drayage trucks queued for miles, and shipping companies hastily leased additional cranes. Freight forwarders described the situation with uncharacteristic drama. The canal sneezed, and we all caught the cold. For economies built on just-in-time delivery, the disruption was worse than a blockade. It was uncertainty. Captain scheduling software, once routine and predictive, filled with red unknown flags where Panama updates should have been. Insurance underwriters raised premiums on high-value cargo, citing force majeure risk tied to hydrological instability. It meant the world was now officially pricing climate volatility into maritime trade. Historically, the canal had endured crises before: landslides, political unrest, even brief closures for maintenance. But nothing had fractured schedules on this scale, because previous stoppages had timelines. Drought didn't. It whispered ambiguity into every contract. When shippers asked when normal operations would resume, the only honest answer was, when it rains. That made planning impossible and panic rational. Commodity markets began to mirror the canal's tempo. Coffee futures in New York spiked after exporters in Colombia reported containers stuck at Balboa. Asian seafood shipments spoiled waiting for clearance. Grain traders shifted bulk loads back through U.S. Gulf ports. Logistics firms resurrected rail routes abandoned decades ago. Every workaround came at a premium, which meant consumers absorbed the cost. In a matter of months, a logistical inconvenience had turned into inflation you could feel at checkout counters. Meanwhile, the canal's reputation, as predictable as the tides, took a reputational bruise. Maritime forecasts downgraded punctuality ratings for the first time in a century. Shippers who once paid extra tolls for guaranteed slots started diversifying routes, even if slower. Supply chain managers quietly replaced the word Panama with variable in planning documents. Reliability, once the canal's defining export, became its casualty. Economists liken the effect to a global dam bursting, only in reverse. Instead of water flooding markets, absence trickled through them. The world's interconnectedness magnified each missing shipment's consequence. A delayed container of microchips meant paused assembly lines, which meant postponed car deliveries, which meant lost retail demand, which rippled back to metal foundries ordering less ore. From electronics to energy, the drought became invisible bookkeeping ink, connecting countless postponements. Financial analysts tried to quantify it. By late season, research groups estimated total economic losses linked to canal delays exceeded $15 billion, yet those figures couldn't capture cascading inefficiencies: warehouses paying overtime, factories idled, perishable goods discarded. Economies don't have a unit for disruption, only for output, and output everywhere dipped by fractions that summed to billions. Allied insurance data told another story. Maritime incidents, groundings, collisions, mechanical failures rose slightly as ships rushed along longer detours. The Cape of Good Hope saw congested conditions similar to the canal's worst cues. Environmental groups warned the increased fuel usage from extended voyages would release an estimated 3 million extra tons of carbon that year, erasing gains from green shipping initiatives. Climate change had created a feedback loop. Drought reduced transits, rerouting increased emissions, which in turn worsened climate stress. Air freight firms capitalized on the chaos. Airlines offered canal-free delivery guarantees, moving high-value goods across continents at triple the maritime price. Logistics companies rebranded crisis as opportunity, promising climate-resilient alternatives. But global analysts cautioned that the sky couldn't absorb the sea. Air cargo could handle electronics, not crude oil or steel. For the heavy arteries of trade, there was still no substitute for water. As the backlog worsened, governments stepped in. The United States convened summits with shipping associations to discuss supply chain resilience. European ministers debated emergency subsidies for energy-intensive industries affected by transit delays. Asian exporters formed coalitions to pressure the Panama Canal Authority for transparency. It was the first time environmental fluctuation in one tropical watershed triggered coordinated policy meetings across continents. Within Panama City, administrators monitored international headlines with a mix of fear and validation. Every mention of Panama bottleneck reinforced urgency for their water security projects. Yet the tone abroad shifted subtly. What used to be admiration for engineering now read as frustration over dependence. Editorials in financial papers questioned why 21st century commerce still hinged on a 19th century style lock system. The drought had exposed not just a canal's vulnerability, but globalization's architecture. Comparisons to the 2021 Suez blockage flooded op-ed pages, but this was worse. The Ever Given incident was a single ship in a single week, visible, dramatic, and fixable. Panama's crisis was invisible and open-ended. There was no container wedged sideways to photograph, only a shrinking lake and missing rain. As one columnist noted, at least the Suez jam could be dug out. You can't excavate clouds. Shipping executives tried to sound calm, but boardroom reports grew bleak. Predictability, the cornerstone of maritime business, had been replaced by probability. Statistical models once used for mechanical failure now included precipitation forecasts. Some insurers even hired meteorologists. Climate science had quietly become logistics strategy. Ports that benefited temporarily from rerouted trade soon realized windfall profits came with future risk. Congestion wearied dockworkers and strained capacity. When the rains finally returned and the canal reopened fully, ports that had expanded hastily found themselves overstaffed. The lesson was sobering. Every adaptation to Panama's crisis carried its own cost and half-life. Cross-supply networks, companies began rewriting doctrines. Diversification of routes once meant balancing between Panama, Suez, and Cape Horn. Now it included evaluating Mexico's new rail corridor or even Arctic passages. The word redundancy, once synonymous with waste, became corporate gospel. Senior executives began referring to climate redundancy as the next frontier of risk management, a sophisticated phrase for keeping options when the weather disagrees. What happened during that season proved that global trade isn't a machine but an ecosystem, sensitive to one missing link. The canal's slowdown reminded businesses that efficiency without resilience is fragility by another name. Every cost-cutting shortcut, every geographic optimization assumed stability. Panama's drought erased that assumption overnight. For households far removed from shipping lanes, the symptoms appeared mundane: higher prices, back-ordered electronics, fluctuations in fuel bills. Yet behind each inconvenience was the same invisible cause: a patch of dry ground in Central America where rain failed to fall. The canal's drought had become a parable for the entire global economy, intricate, brilliant, and utterly unprepared for unpredictability. By the time operations normalized months later, the world's confidence hadn't returned with the rainfall. Businesses didn't forget the waiting weeks, the uncertain forecasts, or the realization that climate can silence commerce. Economists labeled it the Panama shock. Like any good cautionary term, it carried more than data, it carried memory. Panama rebounded, but slowly. Trade flows resumed, yet the mindset changed. The canal's clients now treated every season like a coin toss, and financiers viewed hydrology charts as serious as earnings reports. Across continents, leaders invoked the event as argument for climate investment and diversified logistics. The Great Drought, as some called it, had done what decades of conferences hadn't. It grounded the abstract threat of climate change in container schedules and balance sheets. Psychologically, it changed something larger. It made audiences everywhere feel the fragility of modern life in their wallets, showing that climate change isn't a distant headline, but a daily variable in human security and comfort. In the end, the domino effect wasn't just economic, it was philosophical. The world had built prosperity on precision, assuming that nature would always cooperate. Panama proved otherwise. From boardrooms to breakfast tables, everyone learned a simple equation: when one lake runs dry, no ocean is far enough away. The rise of the alternatives. The drought was just Panama's crisis. It was an invitation. As ships idled near Colón and Balboa, across the Americas, governments began pulling dust-covered blueprints from their archives. Each claimed to hold the key to the same problem: how to move cargo from one ocean to another without relying on Panama's uncertain rainfall. What had once been ideas of convenience suddenly looked like plans of survival. In southern Mexico, freight trains thundered for the first time along the revived interoceanic corridor, a 308-kilometer dry canal laser straight across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. Completed in phases since 2025, it linked the Gulf port of Coatzacoalcos to the Pacific Salina cruise. Container cranes rose where mango groves used to stand, hoisting steel boxes onto railcars that promised to cross in under 6 hours. half a day compared to delays of weeks at Panama. The project cost roughly $7.5 billion, a fraction of Panama's canal toll revenue, but its symbolism was priceless, proof that geography could be reinterpreted again. For the Mexican government, it was both a nationalist triumph and a strategic calculation. "We are showing," one transport minister said, "that movement doesn't depend on one country's reign." Early test convoys carried automotive parts bound for the U.S. Midwest and electronics headed for Asia. Freight analysts estimated that once fully operational, the corridor could handle up to 1.4 million containers annually by the early 2003s, small compared with Panama's scale, but enough to alter shipping mathematics. Companies with flexible cargo, especially high-value goods, began booking trial routes. The corridor's slogan, "From coast to coast without a drop," wasn't just marketing, it was a jab at Panama's predicament. Meanwhile, Nicaragua resurfaced in headlines with its phantom ambition, the $64 billion Nicaragua Canal, a project that had once promised to eclipse Panama entirely. After a decade stalled by environmental outcry and vanished investors, the plan still existed in political speeches if not reality. Chinese financing, which once backed it enthusiastically, had dried up under economic pressure and uncertainty. Yet during Panama's drought, rumors buzzed again. Could new investors, lured by global bottlenecks, resurrect it? An environmental journalist visiting the overgrown survey lines found old billboard frames still whispering that dream. El Canal del Futuro, the canal of the future. South along the Andes spine, Colombia pitched its own answer, a bi-oceanic railway linking the Caribbean port of Cartagena to the Pacific city of Buenaventura. Private briefings indicated Chinese investment interest, though officials kept details quiet. The proposed rail line, more than 800 kilometers long, would haul containers and bulk exports over mountain ranges higher than Panama's highest locks. Environmentalists scoffed at the energy cost. Economists countered that even imperfect redundancy was priceless after the drought's chaos. Further north, the United States rediscovered geographic imagination. Analysts proposed upgrading existing rail and pipeline networks across Mexico and Texas to create a continental logistics corridor connecting Pacific and Gulf ports. It wasn't about bypassing Panama directly, it was about ensuring against its failure. Every government with access to two coasts suddenly saw an opportunity wrapped in urgency. But the real wild card lay far above latitude 18. In the melting Arctic, shipping routes once locked in ice had begun opening for longer stretches each year. Satellite images showed freighters venturing along Russia's Northern Sea route, shaving as much as 40% off the Europe-Asia distance compared to the route through Suez, and bypassing Panama entirely. By 2026, Moscow had poured $215 billion into icebreakers, ports, and insurance incentives, announcing ambitions for year-round navigation by 2003. Cargo once destined for Panama's humid tropics now glided past glaciers under 24-hour daylight. Not to be outdone, Canada quietly mapped improvements to its own Northwest Passage, a labyrinth of icy channels through its Arctic archipelago. Though still navigable only a few months per year, climate models predicted expanding windows. When a small fleet of container vessels completed the passage without escort in late 2025, headlines portrayed it as a hint of the future, a risky, shorter, carbon-contradictory future born from warming seas. One maritime economist quipped, "The world's next canal might be made by melting, not machinery." Despite the excitement, none of these alternatives offered a perfect replacement. Mexico's rail bridge required double handling, containers unloaded, shifted to train, then loaded again. Nicaragua's dream remained mired in legal limbo and public distrust. Colombia's terrain promised engineering nightmares and political scandal potential. The Arctic routes were seasonal, perilously dependent on ice forecasts, and fraught with geopolitical tension between Russia, Canada, and the United States. Yet collectively, they embodied a truth the drought had forced everyone to admit. Redundancy was now essential. Shipping companies didn't wait for governments. Major logistics multinationals began drafting Panama contingency maps, spider webs of alternate journeys, factoring cost versus reliability. Some combined air freight with Mexican rail, others offset east-west congestion by expanding transatlantic trade. Ports from Long Beach to Rotterdam announced new alliances, pitching themselves as branches of a diversified global circulatory system. One executive described it as building extra hearts for when the main one coughs. Inside Panama City, these developments struck an uneasy chord. On one hand, officials publicly welcomed regional connectivity, talking about shared hemispheric resilience. Privately, they recognized the threat. Every kilometer of new infrastructure elsewhere meant a potential dent in their toll revenue, their GDP, their national pride. A think tank report circulated within government corridors estimated that if the Mexican and Colombian corridors achieved only half their targets, Panama could lose up to 15% of its long-term transit share. Drought hadn't just altered water levels, it was eroding monopoly. The geopolitical balance began reflecting that shift. The United States praised Mexico's corridor as complementary to, not competitive with, Panama, diplomatic politeness masking strategic diversification. China, meanwhile, expressed interest in participating in multiple projects simultaneously, spreading influence across alternative routes. Analysts dubbed it the multipolar logistics age, where no single crossing point could claim absolute dominance. Skeptics warned that the excitement overlooked harsh realities. Each massive project required environmental sacrifice, deforestation in Oaxaca, displacement in Colombia, ice risk in the Arctic. Critics called it the era of climate cannibalism, building new paths in response to climate damage that those very paths would exacerbate. Every rail line and port upgrade burned concrete and fuel. Every Arctic trial voyage emitted the carbon that melted its own highway. Yet the momentum continued, propelled less by optimism and more by fear of stagnation. By 2026, maritime magazines published comparative charts: transit time via Panama, unreliable, versus via Mexico, predictable. The column titles were neutral, but the implication was, shippers didn't need perfection, they needed certainty. And in a warming world, certainty had migrated north. For ordinary Panamanians, these global developments felt distant yet personal. Taxi drivers discussed Mexico's corridor on daily radio, voicing both curiosity and defensiveness. They can build trains, one caller said, but they don't have Gatún. Another replied, maybe they don't need it. Such exchanges reflected a national anxiety that Panama's singular claim to fame might no longer be singular. In boardrooms, the ACP reassured investors that the canal remained irreplaceable for bulk transport, energy products, massive LNG tankers, supercarriers that no rail could match. But they recognized a new psychology in trade. Clients hedged loyalties. When contracts once read "ship via Panama," they now included escape clauses tied to water levels. Diversification wasn't theory anymore. It was line 17, subsection B of maritime agreements. And so, as the world explored alternatives, Panama entered an era of comparative scrutiny. Every efficiency gain elsewhere became its problem, every delay its cautionary tale. The canal was still pivotal, but no longer alone. For the first time in more than a century, humanity's routes between oceans were multiplying instead of converging. It was as if the planet, through political will, melting ice, and technological persistence, was reinventing geography yet again. And here's the psychological twist. Progress feels thrilling until it splits into fear of being left behind. Panama had once united the seas, now climate stress was encouraging them to separate. The isthmus that once symbolized connection had triggered competition, and every new line traced on a map marked both progress and loss. For traders and nations alike, the moral was uncomfortably clear: reliance is weakness. The age of single points had ended. In its place, a mosaic of imperfect routes, some by rail, some by river, some by thawing ice, was forming a new cartography of resilience. The global map that climate change had begun erasing was being redrawn, piece by uncertain piece, around a question Panama had already answered with bitter experience: what happens when the water stops? Life on the edge of a water war. By the time the drought's second year arrived, the phrase locals used wasn't shortage anymore, it was the struggle. In Panama City, water trucks moved through neighborhoods escorted by police, carrying tanks labeled for domestic priority. Crowds sometimes pressed too close, arguing over who would fill their containers first. It had the tense atmosphere of rationing, but this wasn't wartime. It was the ordinary outcome of extraordinary dryness. And hovering above it all was the constant reminder that vast reserves of water still existed, locked away behind the canal's restricted gates, reserved for ships. Along the shores of Gatún Lake, the contrast between purpose and pain couldn't have been starker. Families who had lived there for generations watched the lake shrink into cracked mosaics where children once swam. Fishermen beached their boats on mud, walking out to collect stranded fish left gasping in shallow pools. "We send water to the world," one said, pointing to the distant line of container ships waiting offshore, "but we can't drink our own." His remark captured the inversion unfolding across the basin. Global commerce remained privileged, while local survival became precarious. In the town of Orosmina, near the canal's midpoint, residents gathered nightly in the community hall to debate how much to petition the government for relief. The older generation remembered the canal's expansion ceremonies, televised pride in concrete ribbon cuttings. Now, younger voices spoke of desperation. "They tell us the lake must serve everyone," one woman said, "but their everyone doesn't include us." Outside the hall, the air smelled faintly of dust and diesel, two substances replacing the scent of rain. Urban Panama felt a slower sort of emergency. The capital's glittering skyline, built on canal revenue, now experienced rolling water outages. Restaurants served bottled water only, offices installed ration dispensers, and residents filled bathtubs in anticipation of another dry weekend. What started as inconvenience hardened into resentment. Hashtags demanding reform trended online. Agua para Panama, El Canal no Bibe. Memes compared photos of drought-stricken villages to images of luxury ships gliding through the locks. The humor was bitter, the meaning clear. Someone was choosing profit over people. Official press conferences tried to soothe tensions. The Canal Authority emphasized that operations directly funded national programs, the same hospitals and roads the protesters used. "If the canal stops, the country stops," a spokesperson repeated on live television. But the message landed flat. To those carrying empty buckets, that logic sounded circular. How valuable was global trade if basic dignity dried up with it? Arguments that once felt patriotic now felt detached from reality. Behind closed doors, government ministers circulated intelligence briefs using a new phrase, social volatility linked to water perception. Essentially, they feared unrest. Remote communities along the Chagas River threatened to block access roads to pumping stations unless new wells were drilled. In coastal barrios, graffiti appeared overnight, El Canal roba nuestra lluvia. Rumors spread that international corporations had priority access to the canal's freshwater reserves. The rumors weren't true, but truth mattered less than trust, and trust was evaporating as quickly as the reservoirs. Environmental groups held marches through the capital, mixing climate activists with union workers demanding accountability. Handmade signs read, "Without lakes, no locks," flipping the government's own slogan back on itself. Their protests spotlighted how deforestation in canal watersheds had worsened the drought, forests that had been cleared decades ago to expand infrastructure. Scientists testified that reforestation could stabilize rain cycles, yet funding flowed primarily to concrete projects. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The solution kept ignoring the cause. As weeks passed, rural tensions spread inward. Small farmers along dried tributaries abandoned crops, moving toward the city in search of work. The influx strained already limited utilities. Temporary settlements sprang up along the urban fringe, satellite towns of drought refugees within their own country. Aid groups distributed water filters and plastic tanks, but supply was patchwork. One volunteer described the sound of dawn in those camps, generators sputtering, buckets clanging, and radio static carrying weather forecasts like prayers. Each cloudy morning offered both hope and accusation. By mid-season, police patrolled key pumping stations to prevent theft. They weren't guarding cash or fuel, just flow valves and storage basins. Incidents of sabotage were rare but symbolically explosive. When vandals cut a monitoring cable near Miraflores Lock, the story dominated headlines. Was it protest or desperation? Either way, commentators began using a phrase that had once seemed hyperbolic: La Guerra del Agua. The water war wasn't fought with weapons, but with perception, policy, and privilege. Within the canal workforce, morale fractured. Some employees faced hostility on their commutes, accused of serving foreigners over fellow citizens. The ACP organized community outreach, sending engineers to explain the physics of lake management. They spoke of balancing salinity, minimum depths, and hydraulic pressure. To them, these were equations of necessity. To frustrated residents, they were excuses couched in jargon. It revealed a disconnect deeper than any canal chamber, the gap between national pride and lived experience. Local media amplified the divide. Talk shows hosted fiery debates between economists defending trade priorities and environmentalists demanding a human-first water policy. A ship carries revenue, one panelist argued. A family carries survival, the other shot back. The exchanges echoed across taxi radios and office cafeterias. For a country long united by the canal's success, disagreement felt like betrayal. Yet it was also honesty surfacing after decades of polite silence. Meanwhile, ecclesiastical groups and NGOs stepped into the vacuum. Churches opened courtyards for water distribution, framing conservation as moral duty. Sermons invoked stewardship of creation alongside civic responsibility. Civic volunteers cleaned drainage canals to capture every drop of runoff. Acts once dismissed as symbolic took on the gravity of resistance, small gestures reclaiming agency from bureaucratic paralysis. The drought also rekindled indigenous perspectives long marginalized. Leaders from the Guna and Embera communities reminded the nation that their ancestors had managed rainforest watersheds sustainably for centuries. They proposed reviving traditional terracing and planting techniques to improve catchment resilience. During one televised panel, a Guna elder said quietly, "We told you if you cut the trees, the rain will leave." Viewers who once regarded such remarks as folklore now called it prophecy. International journalists descended, drawn by the juxtaposition of luxury vessels gliding above waterless towns. Headlines coined phrases like trade versus thirst and the globalization of scarcity. Footage of villagers hauling buckets under passing container ships went viral. The imagery was too stark to ignore. Panama, once an emblem of connection, became a metaphor for imbalance, the very engine of world commerce colliding with the limits of ecology. Politically, the pressure forced concessions. The government announced a social water compact, promising to allocate a fixed percentage of reservoir capacity for human use, regardless of canal demand. Critics applauded the symbolism, but noted the loophole. In national emergencies, trade could still override. Yet even symbolic concessions mattered. For the first time, public policy formally recognized water as both an economic and human right. That acknowledgement was, in its own quiet way, a revolution. By the season's end, rains returned hesitantly. Relief washed through the nation like rumor first, then reality. Reservoir readings climbed, and the immediate tension eased. But something irreversible had changed. Trust, once abundant, now had a drought of its own. Villages kept their new cooperatives. Community wells became permanent fixtures. The phrase water war faded from newspapers, but lingered in everyday language, shorthand for a wound still healing. For many Panamanians, the lesson wasn't just about rainfall, it was about recognition. They had discovered that the canal's story, told for a century as triumph of engineering, was also a story of exclusion. The same system that connected oceans had disconnected neighbors from their own resource. To fix it, they realized, required not only dams and pipelines, but humility, the understanding that national pride means little if it doesn't quench collective thirst. As the next wet season loomed, forecasts hinted at another weak cycle. People didn't panic this time, they prepared. New rainwater cisterns crowned rooftops across Panama City, and rural cooperatives built seed banks for drought-resistant crops. Awareness had replaced denial. In radio interviews, locals spoke with weary wit. "Maybe we can't control the rain," one said, "but at least now we share what falls." And somewhere between Gatun's receding banks and the city's flickering streetlights, Panama began to recalibrate its definition of stability. Not the illusion of endless water, but the practice of balance, between trade and life, between progress and preservation. The era of assuming abundance was over. In its place stood an uneasy but necessary wisdom: every drop counts, and every decision has a downstream. The future: adapt or fail. By 2028, the Panama Canal Authority had stopped talking about normal operations. There was no normal anymore, only managing variance. Every season began with forecasts more studied than shipping manifests, rain probabilities analyzed like stock trends. The world had moved from admiring the canal's engineering to scrutinizing its resilience. What had once been a symbol of mastery over nature was now a measure of how quickly humanity could adapt to it. Inside the ACP's control center, new maps glowed on digital panels. Alongside cargo routes were color bands showing rainfall anomalies, evaporation rates, and reservoir projections through 2035. The data felt less like weather and more like prophecy. The canal's future depended on turning that prophecy into survival. Every project, from dredging to dam construction, now revolved around a single directive: adapt or fail. At the heart of that directive stood a sweeping initiative called Water Sustainability 205. It combined infrastructure with experimentation, diversifying water sources, decarbonizing operations, and reimagining what a canal could be in a volatile century. The program's showcase was the newly completed Indio Reservoir, capable of rerouting millions of cubic meters into Gatún. But more quietly, engineers pushed ideas once dismissed as fantasy: desalination plants along the Pacific and recycled water systems to reuse, lock discharge. What had started as emergency measures during the 2023 drought had matured into blueprints for permanent systems. Hydrologist teams tested AI-driven water forecasting, training algorithms on decades of rainfall data. These models could predict basin inflows with surprising accuracy weeks ahead, allowing administrators to adjust transit slots before shortages turned critical. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave the canal something it hadn't had for years: lead time. Engineers described it as learning to surf the drought instead of drown in it. Then came decarbonization. Cargo itself now traveled beneath banners of climate responsibility, and the ACP wanted to match that tone. Solar arrays stretched along maintenance zones, pilot projects converted tugboats to electric propulsion. The canal announced its ambition to reach carbon neutrality by 2005, aligning with international maritime targets. To outsiders, the pledge sounded like public relations. To insiders, it was necessity. The canal's very credibility hinged on proving that it wasn't just a victim of climate change, it was part of the defense. Still, every technological solution carried uncertainty. Forecasts charted hotter years ahead, even under optimistic emissions cuts. Wet seasons were expected to shorten, dry seasons to intensify. Some scientists warned that unless greenhouse gas trends reversed drastically, Panama's droughts would become the baseline rather than the anomaly. The canal's adaptation, though vital, risked being outrun by the climate curve itself. That tension shaped boardroom debates. Should Panama keep pouring billions into engineering resilience, or pivot toward partial transformation, accepting that the canal's peak as global superhighway might already be behind it? Some economists proposed turning parts of the canal zone into a logistics and data hub corridor, using its geographic position for digital as well as physical trade. Others argued to double down on control of infrastructure: more lakes, more pumps, bigger margins for survival. Between them lay the core dilemma of the century: diversify or defend. For ordinary Panamanians, that choice wasn't abstract. Expansion meant jobs, diversification offered stability. University programs now trained a new generation of water scientists and climate engineers. High school curricula added hydrological literacy next to civic studies. Awareness had become policy. The Canal Authority held open days inviting citizens to view rainfall simulations, part outreach, part reassurance. The message was consistent. Adaptation wasn't optional, it was identity. Meanwhile, pressure from abroad grew. Investors demanded environmental proof of concepts before renewing long-term shipping contracts. Multinational corporations linked their sustainability ratings to the canal's carbon metrics. Rating agencies debated adding a climate resilience index, to national credit evaluations. Panama's ability to assure water security became a financial instrument in itself. The correlation between rainfall and risk premium was suddenly direct. This fusion of environment and economics created new kinds of diplomacy. Panamanian negotiators at climate summits now framed their case not merely as a small nation needing aid, but as custodians of 6% of world trade. "Help us hold the reins," one delegate said in Geneva, "and you help yourselves." It was an argument that turned geography into leverage, an ecological version of collective security. Yet at home, skepticism endured. The Rio Indio project still faced lawsuits from displaced families, and environmental reparations moved slowly. Deforestation bans were inconsistently enforced. Reforestation programs lagged behind targets. Even as technology advanced, trust did not. Experts warned that adaptation would fail if social consent eroded faster than rainfall. A climate-resilient canal required a climate-resilient country. In 203, a symbolic gesture tried to bridge that divide. The ACP launched the Rain Pact, a public commitment where households, industries, and the canal itself pledged proportional conservation during dry seasons. It was voluntary but visible. Digital dashboards displayed daily compliance. When drought returned 2 years later, water rationing unfolded with less chaos. The pact hadn't solved scarcity, but it had synchronized response. For the first time in memory, the narrative shifted from blame to cooperation. Technologically, adaptation accelerated. Floating solar farms began operation on a Lajuela lake, simultaneously reducing evaporation and powering lock equipment. Engineers installed adjustable spillways, enabling micromanagement of water levels with centimeter precision. Smarter sensors replaced manual gauges, feeding real-time data into global shipping platforms. Captains could now check hydrological updates alongside tide tables. The canal was learning to speak the language of uncertainty fluently. But innovation had limits. No algorithm could summon clouds. No solar panel could refill lakes. By mid-203 scenarios, average rainfall across Panama's basin was projected to decline another 10%. That translated into one lost ship transit per day on average, a drip bleed that global commerce noticed. The ACP considered temporal pricing, charging higher tolls in dry months to offset reduced capacity and encourage climate-conscious scheduling. Economists praised the creativity, politicians feared backlash. Price the water accurately and you save the canal. Politically, you could drown. Beyond Panama's borders, trade patterns evolved with this rhythm. Mexico's corridor, Arctic routes, and advanced rail systems ate small but tangible shares of traffic. Yet paradoxically, those alternatives made the canal even more indispensable as part of a diversified web rather than a solitary artery. The 21st century turned interdependence into strategy, and Panama's role shifted from monopoly to mediator. That recalibration might ultimately save it. To ensure longevity, the government aligned its planning to sustainability finance. International green bonds funded watershed reforestation. Global insurers offered discounted premiums for resilience projects. Panama became a testbed for climate economics, where water security seeded creditworthiness. Every raindrop quantified, every policy tied to precipitation models. It was the monetization of adaptation, critical, imperfect, and remarkably human. Culturally, reckoning deepened. Documentaries and classroom lessons recast the canal's history not as victory over nature, but as partnership with it. Statues once celebrating engineers now stood beside new memorials honoring displaced communities and environmental stewards. Panama's narrative shifted from pride alone to pragmatic humility. "We live between oceans," a teacher told her students, "but our survival comes from the sky." By the late 203s, that philosophy defined policy. The canal became both laboratory and symbol for a world confronting similar choices: rebuild for resilience or watch systems designed for yesterday collapse under tomorrow's climate. Delegations from drought-hit regions in Africa and Asia toured Gatún to study Panama's hybrid of infrastructure and adaptation diplomacy. What began as a local crisis had evolved into a global classroom. Still behind progress persisted unease. Each minor drought revived memories of paralysis. Economists warned that adaptation, if financed endlessly, could morph into dependency. the canal surviving only through constant capital infusion. Nature, indifferent to balance sheets, offered no guarantees. "We're engineering time," one ACP scientist said, buying years in installments before the math stops working. And yet Panama persisted. Rain fell sporadically but sufficiently, the locks groaned but functioned. In balconies overlooking the Pacific approach, children pointed to passing vessels and repeated the same fascination their ancestors once felt. Only now their wonder carried an undertone of awareness. Those ships moved not by miracle, but by management. Survival itself had become the spectacle. The canal's future, then, won't hinge on regaining its old certainty, but embracing dynamic balance, less domination of nature, more negotiation with it. In every droplet recycled, every community reforested, every algorithm forecasting storm cycles, Panama is rewriting its pact with the planet. The question that remains is whether the canal can continue. It's whether the world can learn fast enough from its example. Because the story of Panama's canal, the droughts endured, the billions poured, the fragile triumphs, isn't just one nation's engineering saga. It's a preview of the century ahead, where every infrastructure, from ports to power grids, must answer the same quiet ultimatum whispering through dry tropical air: adapt or fail. The weight of water. The canal's greatest danger was never flood, it was thirst. One glance at the cracked clay of Gatún during the dry season told the story, an empire of trade balanced on a reservoir's whim. Each ship that crosses carries a fragment of that fragility, proof that modern civilization still depends on the rhythm of clouds. A single missing storm can ripple through economies, shut ports, and quiet industries thousands of miles away. What vanishes when the lakes fall isn't just water, it's confidence, the illusion that human systems outrun natural ones. The drought transformed Panama from symbol of control to lesson in consequence, and that lesson stretches far beyond its shores. What happens here foreshadows every place where climate meets commerce. For nations watching, the canal is a mirror, progress built faster than the planet can sustain. For Panama, it's a reminder that sovereignty now includes stewardship. Tomorrow's prosperity may depend less on expansion and more on harmony with the rain. Because in the end, water, not steel, decides who moves and who waits. That's the psychological hook of the story, the realization that our entire modern world still runs on ancient instincts. Chase abundance, ignore fragility, repeat. If the canal falters again, the shock won't stay contained between oceans. It will echo through supply chains, markets, and households everywhere. If you want to see how another vital choke point faces the same equation, climate against commerce, watch what's coming next. Subscribe for more untold intersections of nature and power, where the future depends, drop by drop, on understanding the weight of water.